Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
They bunch everyone over 70 as though they're all part of one kind of crazy old people's club.
Hello, I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph chief political correspondent, and welcome to Chopper's Politics. Before we get into politics though, happy 100th birthday to Captain Tom Moore, now an honorary colonel who has raised over £30 million for NHS charities. What a legend. Right, back to Westminster. What a few weeks for Boris Johnson. Here's a man who nearly died from coronavirus, then had a baby, all the time trying to lead the fight against the biggest health crisis in the UK for decades, perhaps ever. And you think your life has been thrown into turmoil by COVID-19. No wonder the PM had to delay his paternity leave. He's got rather a lot on his plate at the moment. Politics never stops. Thursday does mark some milestones on the way out of this crisis. Health Secretary Matt Hancock will say today whether he delivered on his target of 100,000 tests a day, and Cabinet is expected finally to think about a blueprint for ending the lockdown, but no details probably until next week. Here to discuss that and much more, I'll be joined by Labour peer and broadcasting legend Baroness Bakewell to discuss if a blanket rule on shielding the elderly does more harm than good. And former Labour frontbencher Chris Bryant will be here telling us why a virtual parliament is virtually unworkable. In fact, he thinks it's crap. But first, the government has made a big point of reminding us time and time again that they're being guided by science when it comes to charting a way out of the lockdown. And a former Tory leader, Sir Ian Duncan Smith, who chaired Boris Johnson's leadership campaign last summer, joins me now via the wonder of technology. Sir Ian Duncan Smith, welcome to Chopper's Politics. How are you?
I'm fine so far, thanks.
Now, you know the Prime Minister well. You chaired his leadership campaign last year. In the past month, he's nearly died in an NHS hospital and then seen his son born. How do you think these past few weeks have changed the PM?
Well, that's probably an almost impossible question to answer because he's only been back, really, from the beginning of this week. But I'm sure that's made an impression on him. I think it's probably reinforced many of the views that he had. He's obviously incredibly grateful, as we all are, to the remarkable work that the doctors and nurses and all the support staff do in the NHS. They've been fantastic, and we celebrate them on a daily basis, really, for very good reasons, because they've been incredible. But I think with him, he's facing some very big issues. And I think, first and foremost, I think the biggest issue he's got is how is the balance between trying to get the virus under control and at the same time recognizing that if this lockdown goes on too long, the economy will be seriously damaged. And the balance of that, which I think there's a false dichotomy which is constantly pumped out. But I simply say that it's not a case of a balance between saving lives and saving the economy. It's actually all about saving lives, because if the economy goes down, then of course that puts lives in jeopardy, because, you know, people without jobs, mental health problems, issues, all these things come into the fore on a greater and greater level, and our ability to invest money in public services falls away because tax revenues will also collapse. So there's a balance point, really, between which is effective on both counts.
The government says it follows the science on this, but isn't it more truthful to say that actually it's all political, that essentially all these decisions they're going to make are actually political ones? And certainly the fifth test, the one about not overwhelming the NHS, is one which is one for politics.
Yes, there are two or three things that need to be brought to the fore on this. They are following the science, quite rightly, and scientists advise them. But it's also worth pointing out that when it comes to epidemiology, this is not like physics in the sense that it's not an exact science. You know, epidemiology is probably better described in terms of economics. It's very much like economics. It's much like economists. You get different epidemiologists who disagree, and the same is often with economists. So the idea that somehow the government is getting some exact piece of information that allows them to take an exact and correct action isn't altogether correct. So what they're doing is having to round this up and decide on balance, where is the balance going and where do they make the decision? If there is a concern I have, it's that I think in all of this, there needs to be a huge element of support from behavioural scientists and at the same time economists. behavioral science is really critical to this because it allows you to understand and judge how are people in Britain responding. And that may be completely different in many respects to the way that people behave in Italy or Germany or Spain. So, these things are very, very important to know. Only by studying how we've behaved will we get a sense of how we might behave when we unlock lockdown. One of the issues, for example, will be how keen will the British public be to go back to work? This is an issue that's been prompted by, because I've seen a poll that tells me that the British public quite significantly are concerned about going back to work. So strong has the message been that there is a threat and a danger that now they're beginning to wonder whether going back to work isn't too much of a threat, and that will affect whether parents want to send their children back to school, for example. And this is why behavioral scientists need to be very heavily involved now, because understanding how the public has reacted and then forecasting forward how they will react tells us what we have to say to them, which is one of the reasons why I've been endlessly in the last couple of weeks with some others saying, I believe the government does have to now start talking about coming out of lockdown, explaining what the issues are, explaining why it will be necessary, how it will happen in general terms, but be very clear that if they're not doing it immediately, then to say this will happen and we will give fair warning about how it will happen. But people have got to make plans. They've got to get their heads around the idea of this. And I think that's important.
So what you want to see is a major advertising campaign about how we get out of this, or what the route path is, and to stop almost infantilizing the public and tell them exactly what's going on. Is that what you want?
Yes, I want to be able to get the public to be taken along with us on this. I think it's important. The public have behaved incredibly well so far, really, really well, better than most people had expected. And I think, therefore, it's important. I mean, I was the one, I think, that coined the phrase, first, don't treat them like children, about 2-3 weeks ago. The reason I said that is because I just think we need to trust the public to be able to figure this out with us as to what needs to happen. And I think that needs to start pretty soon.
Where do you sit on testing? We'll find out today, or maybe tomorrow, whether Matt Hancock's hit his 100,000 tests a day. Has that been a distraction, a good thing? Is it whipped Whitehall into shape, do you think?
Well, certainly it's important to get the testing up. This is only a stepping stone. We'll have to be testing when we go back in on a much wider scale, but this is a good start. But I think, therefore, they've responded to it. If there is an observation, I think the Army has hugely helped now in both the distribution of things like PPE, but also in setting up the testing centres. The truth is, my view is that there's only one organisation that organises for disaster the whole time, and that's the Army, the armed forces, should I say, Navy, Air Force and Army. And that's what their job to do is. And I would therefore have said that now they're in and involved, they're doing a remarkable job at getting these testing centres close to where the need is, because you can't expect, I think, a care worker coming off shift to travel 20 miles or something to go and get tested, or coming on shift to get into a car. They may not have a car. So having test centres in all the main areas is vital, and that's what they're rolling out now, which will increase and improve their ability to be able to meet their tests, because they're able to test many more than are actually being tested. So that's the key gap to close.
And so targets work, don't they, you're saying, in government, even though they're...
Well, ultimately, internal targeting absolutely works, but you need to make sure the targeting is achievable. They always say that you make people reach longer and further than they think they can. That's absolutely right. But you need to make sure that there is a fair chance that they'll get there. So, yes, it was right, I think, to say we have a target. But the media, no criticism of you personally, but the media have all grabbed that as though that's some element of the 10 Commandments. It's not actually. It just indicates where we're going.
It's a way to judge success, isn't it? A binary, almost a binary way of doing it.
Yeah.
How would you like to see lockdown eased? Michael Gove is discussing about how they might lift it, first of all, in islands like the Isle of Wight, Scottish Islands, and then test this track and trace technology in those areas before applying it to mainland Britain as a whole. Is that wise, do you think? Or would you do a regional lifting, maybe Cornwall and other areas?
Oh, no, I don't agree with any of that. We published a paper, there was a Professor Ormerod and Gerard Lowndes, who are two eminent economists, and with discussions with others, and I got involved with that. And the view of that is, don't do it regionally, because it doesn't tell you anything. The peculiar problem we've got with the UK is that we are incredibly London-centric, more perhaps than most other countries, and we need to do something about that, which is one of the government's issues that it's to deal with. But right now, for the pandemic, you've seen that most of the pandemic centres in around London. And so you can't test something in a faraway place because it won't replicate what you're going to see in London. So the important thing is we have to look to roll out everywhere, but do it in a limited way. And actually, what I simply say is that it's all very well to say we will need to test and everything else, but there are countries that have done this and are doing this right now. So we can go and look at see what their examples are. And I have to bring everybody back to Sweden at the same time. I mean, Sweden did not go into lockdown. And I've seen a very interesting chart that shows if you look at them brought in line with the scale of the country, so it's on the same scale as the UK, you see that they mirror the UK's behaviour. And so it may be worth looking at Sweden to see how they've allowed businesses to operate for us to be able to understand how we might allow businesses to open again. And I think there are some very good lessons elsewhere.
And it could be some companies more than others. So it could be those working in the outside, like construction, in garden centres, farming, and others, more than those working indoors, where it can fester more this dreadful virus.
Yes, I mean, I do think the high street needs to be opening up fairly soon because that will take the pressure off. It also, in many senses, many of the shops are open already now and are doing social distancing. But my point is that we need to look at what I call areas of the economy that can be opened rather than regional places. Because, if you're dealing with a place in one of these islands, they're not going to tell you how financial services is going to work. They're not going to tell you how other services, which are our big exporters in health and education and things, how will they all work, or how will the car industry work? You need, therefore, to test this across the board, looking at sectors rather than regions.
Do you worry, Ian Duncan Smith, about the elderly and the way they're being treated in this pandemic? I mean, age 70 is an arbitrary age, and yet that's the age at which people are being told they can't go out at all, even though, of course, we know some very healthy over 70s as much as some very unhealthy under 70s.
I think it was right to try and draw attention to the groups that are most likely to be threatened by this. Bear in mind that the recovery rate for coronavirus is incredibly high. So obviously, the people that suffer most are those in certain categories. I think as we go forward, though, it's really got to be to do with your own health that really matters, because people who are very poor health, who are quite young, will be badly affected as much as somebody who's elderly who has bad health. But somebody who's fit and keeps and looks after themselves, isn't obese, because one of the areas I gather is obesity, the other one is smoking, these sort of things. People who don't and aren't in those categories, but maybe over 70, and there are plenty that you meet, I suspect they're no more at risk than somebody in their 40s or 50s who's in a similar category. The point is really, I think, it's conditions, and you need to look at the most vulnerable. So it's not just wholly the elderly, it's really about conditions that need to be protected. People who have ongoing conditions are obviously most at risk. And it will also be considered to be quite autocratic if we suddenly tell one group, only defined by age, that they can't go and do the work that they've got to do. That in itself, I don't think, would survive. So I think it's a balance, and that's why the government's got to talk this through with the public so that we don't get just a lockdown of one group, whereas the rest, unhealthy people from the other groups, end up going out, and you'll get an increased R factor.
That's right, and we see Jeremy Corbyn on the benches, didn't we, in the House of Commons on Wednesday?
Yes, I mean,
he's able to, for example.
Yeah, there are plenty of people I know who are incredibly fit in their 70s and even in the 80s, and you've seen the whole process with people passing 100 still doing things.
Yeah, good old Captain Tom Moore, quite.
Yes, Captain Tom, of course. He's now walking and looks very fit.
Yeah, he's now an honorary colonel, I should say, shouldn't I? Is that right?
Yeah, no, he's an honorary colonel. Yep, there.
Looking forward, you've been very hot on the issue of China and our relationship with China over the past year, particularly over the Huawei company, whether that should be involved in a 5G network. How will this change that relationship going forward, do you think?
I want it to change dramatically, and I want it not just for us, but for the whole of the free world to understand they've made a major error. We have rushed into a kind of dive into China. So much of what we did in the West has now been basically taken over by China. And we've done so on the very simplistic basis that free trade matters, which it does, and that it works. And by and large, it does work. But what people have failed to understand is if you are going to have proper free trade, as Adam Smith originally came up with, you cannot have, in the midst of this, a country of the scale and size of China that is clearly, in terms of its politics, very, very autocratic, dictatorial, does not obey any of the global rules of free trade. It's never signed up fully to the WTO's rules, which operates the free market. It has no sense of human rights for anybody in China. They have a surveillance state now, which is busy giving evidence to lock people up. I mean, all of this sort of thing makes me worried. And I was told by many politicians, not just George Osborne, but others at the time, that we had to go to China because China was the future. The problem was they all said, oh, well, free trade will change the government. They'll open up. They'll eventually become much, much different. In fact, quite the opposite has now happened. They're much more centralized. They're much more controlling and dictatorial. And all of the questions around COVID-19, its outbreak, their suppression of the information, I wrote the other day to say a lot of this was due to their determination to get that free trade deal with America, didn't want anything to disturb it. All of this is down to the nature of their government. And we have to understand that they have strategically set out to dominate whole areas of world trade using their own internal resources in breach of the idea that governments can set and reset markets. So they control 85% of the rare earth materials that go into the making of telephones and computers and batteries. They have the majority of the battery production in the world. They make all the telephones. Everyone's given that to them. Most of your laptops and computers are made in China. They have huge levels of low-scale production. One of the reasons why we can't get some of the hand sanitizers out is because, when they went off for a few weeks, all the production of the bottles that go into that went south. All of that is a scale of the dependency, which we now have to question. It's a reality that we're seeing through COVID. What happens when a government that is unresponsive ends up with a crisis like this? We all catch it.
So once this is over with, you want to see a complete reappraisal of our relationship with China, starting with Huawei and 5G. Is that right?
Well, Huawei and 5G, I think, should now be well and truly dead in the water. The government has yet to bring some bill forward, but as far as I can see, there isn't a single serious conservative who's going to back this. Europe has got to wake up. Their pathetic response the other day to the criticisms of China, when China then came back to them and said, and almost stamped on them, the EU modified their critique to such an extent it was watered down that it's completely worthless. This is the kind of bullying that's taking place. They're bullying Australia at the moment, referring to their concerns as chewing gum on the base of your shoe, as dismissing another state. They've had a go at America, trying to pretend that it was America that started this coronavirus. They are busy. They bullied France the other day by saying that their care homes were a disaster, and that was a deliberate ploy of Chinese to distract attention away from them. And it goes on. They continue to do this, and we have to all stand together on this. Otherwise, we are going to reap the whirlwind of Chinese dominance, which will be very damaging to us all.
Okay. Ian Duncan Smith, just finally, when do you think life will get back to normal in Britain after this crisis?
There are two elements to this which are important. The first is how we go about living in a world that still has coronavirus and keeping the new normal as social distancing. That is critical, and the governments need to make sure they make everyone aware of that. So even if we go back to work, we don't. And the second thing is the arrival of antivirals. And we've heard some very good news today about antivirals, this drug that they're testing at the moment, which is proving very, very effective. And the second element is the arrival of vaccines. Now, those will change things and bring it back to a more normal position. But in the absence of those at the moment, and some of those may arrive earlier than we think, then it's the new normal of social distancing. And I think we could start easing.
For how long? For how long? I ask you on behalf of a house full of teenagers who are getting crosser and crosser.
I think that I personally do not think that we can continue this lockdown beyond next week. I think we have to have plans now to be easing the lockdown through May and into June. I think that's the period that I would look at right now. I just can't see that the government can extend this lockdown any further, because I don't believe that it will make anything better. I think the public is making that better by their understanding of social distancing. Now we need to be able to take social distancing into the unlocking.
There'll be a point at which you fear there might be some kind of mass breakout from people's homes.
Already people are taking this into their own hands. People are going onto the streets, they're shopping, they're doing various things. But my general view is, unless you bring them into your confidence, then they won't understand what this is all about. So we need to be able to explain to the British public what we're doing when it comes to unlocking, the reasons for going back to work, how you assure yourselves. And you've got to get the transport authorities have got to plan for how they're going to run transport systems as we progressively, phase by phase, come out of lockdown. So these things take time, but you've got to bring them into your confidence.
Ian Duncan Smith, live from Essex. Thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Right, stay with us. In just a moment, I'll be joined by Labour peer and champion of pensioners and two-time BAFTA-winning broadcaster, Baroness Bakewell, Joan Bakewell, right after this.
Hi listeners, it's Bryant Gordon here. I'm popping into this podcast to tell you all about another Telegraph series called Mad World. It's a podcast in which I chat to household names and unsung heroes about their mental health. From Nadia Hussain from Bake Off to frontline nurses working flat out to save lives. We talk about looking after ourselves during this strange time and remind you that even when you're isolating, you are not alone. Search Mad World wherever you usually download your podcasts.
Right, we're back. And I'm in front of my microphone in my living room. It may not be the Red Lion pub, but this is still Choppers Politics. Now this week, the broadcaster John Humphrys made an impassioned appeal not to patronise the over 70s by extending their shielding lockdown too long. A sentiment echoed in many radio phone-ins and letters to papers. And people in this at-risk age bracket, basically the over 70s, have expressed concerns about what impact a longer period of isolation will have on their health and well-being. And broadcasting legend and Labour peer Joan Bakewell is a well-known champion of pensioners' rights, and she joins me now. Joan Bakewell, welcome to Choppers Politics. An absolute honour to have you as a broadcasting legend. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm bearing up well.
You're in your sitting room, I imagine.
Yes, I am. And I'm still busy. I mean, it's great. You see, the lockdown it's a benefit for freelancers because we don't mind missing out on the world out there, and we can get on with the work we do at home. So really, writers have it made very easily for them.
Back in the day of Labour being in power, you were the voice of the older people. You were an advisor to the government on old people. You weren't paid for the job. Do you think the government has got this pandemic handling right as regard to old people?
Well, it's becoming more important as we go on, isn't it? Because, first of all, we'll set aside the mess that the government made of the whole 13 days delay before calling for the lockdown. I had already gone into lockdown because I had developed a very bad cough. It didn't have a name, and it still doesn't have a name. But I went along to the doctor with it, and she put me on antibiotics, which worked. But I was still in that process of, you know how you're told you must complete the term of the antibiotics or they don't work. So I was still taking antibiotics when the clampdown came. And so I phoned her. She by that time was consulting by phone. And she said, well, look, given your age group and the fact you've got this cough, why don't you simply go straight into isolating and stay there? And so that's why I've just done 50 days.
50 days isolation, and how you? I mean, the ban is on those over 70. It's quite a blanket ban, and of course, people under 70 can be quite unhealthy, and those over 70 can be quite healthy. Is it a fair line to make?
Yes, this is a terrible mistake that is generally made by absolutely everyone, including the government, which is to assume that people over 70 are all the same. Now, they're no more all the same than people between 30 and 60, which is exactly the same time span as 70 to 100. Between the 30 and 60, you don't think of people as all in the same group, do you? But they bunch everyone over 70 as though they're all part of one kind of crazy old people's club and behave, have the same characteristics, live the same sort of lives. And of course, they're as varied and interesting as the rest of the population.
Why is that? Is that because people in government are quite young? I mean, Boris Johnson is 55. He's the oldest in the cabinet. He's advised by people 20 years, 30 years younger than him. Do you think there's a kind of, people can't quite understand, as you say, that when you're 60, you've got another 30 years left in you, or more than that, 40 years left in you?
Well, putting it in a positive critique, I think they could do with some older voices in the cabinet myself. I think there are plenty of wise old birds around who would be very stabilising for what I think is a rather rickety cabinet at the moment. So I think older people do get a certain life experience that gives them a kind of wisdom. Of course, they're not up on the latest trends or the pop music or pop culture. They don't, but they do know how things have run in the past and what failures have been and how things might be improved. So I think older heads are often wiser heads.
Yes. And given that, it might be harder to maintain then this over 70s ban. It's being reviewed next week, the 7th of May. Do you think that ban may need to be varied for health grounds rather than just pure age?
Yes, I think if you start making absolute demands of people over 70, I'm afraid they're going to shake their head and say, now, look here, youngster, it's all very well for you, but we have a different way of looking at life, and we feel this following. And I certainly think if you put an absolute ban on people over 70 and they went to the park and started visiting places, which they shouldn't, the idea of the police rounding up oldies and penalising them for bad behaviour is laughable. I mean, older people are just will be sensible. People who are old know how to be sensible about these things. Also, they know how highly they are at risk, and they don't want to die young. They don't want to die before their time, which is what the phrase that Boris Johnson used. We don't want to go too soon. There's plenty of life still to live.
Absolutely. You're saying, aren't you, don't patronise us. Let us decide for ourselves. We know the risk. We can see what the risk is. But these blanket bans are unfair.
I think you can't just have a blanket ban unless is there going to be a convention in which people are penalised. You can't do that. You've got to invite people to collaborate. Now, if you say to people, we will keep you healthy for longer of your life, of course they'll want to collaborate. Why would they not? But they don't want to have rules that they feel are unreasonable imposed on them. That's completely the wrong way to go. So I think old people are probably reading the papers and taking notice, talking to their families, Skyping, Zooming, doing all the things ways we contact each other. And I think they will make up their own minds, but they're certainly going to resist being told what to do by strapping youngsters.
Quite. Well, how soon might they? Do you think there might be some a mass flouting? We talk about that idea happening amongst young people. Perhaps the elderly might mimic the poll tax marches of the early 1990s.
Well, I think, you see, I probably flouted a little bit myself, because I do find now, after 50 days isolating, I do find I get very kind of low. I'm not depressed. My spirits are low. And the other day, and I felt I absolutely have to get out. So what I did, I don't know whether it's flouting or not, I got into my car and I drove not very far to Regent's Park, and I parked and I walked alone, distancing. I walked around the rose garden there by myself, and then I came home. So I wasn't in touch with anyone, and I wasn't doing absolutely the exact thing I should do. So I just needed to do it. I really felt almost compelled to get out there.
You're in your late 80s, if I may say so, Jo.
Yes.
Is COVID-19 unlike anything you or your generation have seen before?
Well, yes. I mean, I certainly remember the time when children could get polio. I was aware of that in the late war years of children risking polio. So I knew vaccinations were extremely important for us all. I knew that my mother had diphtheria when she was a child. Gosh. I knew that there were lots of dangerous illnesses. I grew up aware of that. But I don't remember any kind of pandemic like this. I've not known anything like this. And I've not known a kind of a country overtaken by interventionist behaviours attempting to avoid any damage to people. And I think that was wonderful. Of course, you know my politics. I sit on the Labour benches. So yes. I hold the Tories responsible for running down the health service. But now they certainly are going to have to fund it thoroughly, aren't they, and rescue it, save it, celebrate it. I mean, one of the things that I was talking about getting low now I'm in isolation. One of the things that really moves me literally to tears is that shot that they put on television when they put smiling pictures of all the people in the National Health Service who have died.
I know.
In the service of their profession. And I just get a lump in my throat because I think it is terrible. That is a terrible, terrible tragedy. And I can't think of its equal at any other time in my life.
No, and there'll be a reckoning about whether they were adequately prepared and protected by the state when they're trying to get people well from this dreadful disease. Just finally, Joan Bakewell, what are your tips to listeners to getting through this? You've been 50 days in isolation. You go for the occasional drive or the walk in the Rose Garden at Regent's Park. Anything else? Are you baking? Are you doing jigsaws when you're not working? What are you doing?
I'm doing all sorts of things. The first thing is to be a little bit organised. If you start drifting, which I did at the beginning, you get really low. So I drew up a schedule. So I have an exercise slot early in the morning. I have a slot when I go for a walk. I have a reading slot. I Zoom with my children at a certain time every day. I do play Scrabble with my daughter who's in Bristol, so we play Scrabble online. And then I have exchanges with a lot of my friends. So the thing is to be busy. I'm doing more cooking than I've done recently. I've revised my cooking skills, so that's quite interesting. So enjoy the things about your inner life, reading, music, friendship. And then you'll realise how important they are. And certainly when you get older, they're very important.
Well, Joan Bakewell, wishing you all the best in isolation, and let's hope we can see you in the flesh at some point soon. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you.
Now, we've had nearly 2 weeks of a virtual parliament, with MPs, just like us, having to grapple with technology in order to do their jobs and hold power to account. But is a virtual parliament fit for purpose? I'm joined by former Labour frontbencher Chris Bryant. Chris Bryant, welcome to the podcast. This finds you in Rhondda, I think.
I am in the Rhondda, yes, and it's raining. We've had weeks of sun, and my garden is now a wilderness.
Now, Chris Bryant, you're known to our listeners as a authority on Parliament, as a historian of Parliament. How do you judge this virtual Parliament as an MP in it?
Well, it's pretty much rubbish as an MP. I mean, I know everybody's tried very hard to create this kind of virtual hybrid parliament and all of that with people calling in from outside and so on. But honestly, so what happens for an MP is, first of all, you have to now bid beforehand to be able to speak on any question or urgent question or statement or debate or whatever. And there were 5 things I wanted to speak on in this week. And in the normal course of a normal parliament, that's pretty much the kind of number of times I'd take part in some kind of debate. You bid, you then get an email saying whether or not you've come in the top 100 of MPs for that particular item. And then they say, and then on the morning, you'll be rung by the Speaker's office to be told whether you're actually on the order paper. So even getting into the 100 doesn't mean that you'll get on the order paper. And then when you're on the order paper, as I was the other day, I was number 46. You still don't get called because we only get to number 23. So the sum total of my contribution so far has been one question.
So for laymen who are not familiar maybe with Parliament, normally you'd go in there, and if you're there at the beginning of the session and you put your name on the list, you can get called. Or if you catch the Speaker's eye, you bob up and down, don't you, like a jack in a box. And if the Speaker sees you, they call you. Those are the 2 ways to ask a question, aren't they, in Parliament?
Well, yes, but normally in a statement, the Minister speaks for 10 minutes, the opposition speaks for 5 minutes, and then you have a free-for-all of anybody who's in the chamber, and you're pretty much guaranteed to get in. The old Speaker, John Bercow, used to call everybody, full stop. The new Speaker has limited these sessions to 45 minutes, which means that more than half the time ends up going to the front bench. So quite a lot of backbenchers are getting a bit fed up that we never get a chance to say anything. And I know MP complains about not getting to speak enough is probably not the most important kind of... I'm not going to get much sympathy for this, but it's just that there's so many issues pouring into our inboxes around, which of the various schemes are working or not working and so on. We're desperate for an opportunity to put those to ministers.
You can put in written questions, can't you? Although I note that Parliament has asked those to be kept down to a minimum because of everyone working from home, even in Parliament, of course.
Yes, Jacob Rees-Mogg gave us a little lecture about how we shouldn't be clogging up ministerial boxes with questions. And I just wanted to go, yes, but I've got 50 businesses in the Rhondda who don't really understand how the furlough system is going to work properly for them.
I mean, in a sense, to be fair to Lindsay Hoyle, the speaker, it has been a triumph of technology. I mean, the Zoom, it has worked. It is cumbersome. You have no way of going back to a bad answer from a minister, do you? You can't sort of, yell at them.
And you lose that sense in the chamber of a minister really being put on the spot because lots of people, hold the same view. Also, I think the questions that people are asking are longer and longer because the speaker, bless him, can't tell people off for talking too long. And so you lose that sense of cut and thrust. And I think that makes it much easier for a government just to sail on regardless.
Yes, but it's an attempt at doing it. I thought this week with Keir Starmer, he's done 2 outings now as new Labour leader. His forensic style of questioning, 6 questions on the issues, did rattle Dominic Raab. And we do miss that, don't we? Because he's the only person who can really do it as things stand in Parliament.
Yes, I think this has worked perfectly for Keir. The forensic kind of lawyerly approach has been really important, and I think that will bear fruit over future years. It's interesting. I'm quite friendly with Dominic, and Dominic has a nervous tick that he does, which is that when he's anxious, his left shoulder sort of goes up a bit for a brief moment, as if he's about to land a right punch.
Yes.
There's been quite a lot of that, I thought.
And there's a vein in his left or right temple which starts to throb. I've noticed that as well. When he's on his mettle and he's pushing forward into the conversation and having a bit of a debate. So that's a kind of it's a tell, as they call it in poker, isn't it? I wonder if that'll be used further.
Yeah, indeed. But like Le Chiffre in Casino Royale, whose eye bleeds, doesn't it? I think it's not quite that bad. But you're quite right. I mean, the whole point of a parliament is that you're meant to parley, and I don't think we're parleying at all. We're just sort of. I mean, we might as well almost send in our essays, as it were.
No, I was going to say, are you sending in questions in advance? So are they being vetted for topic when you submit your question to the start of the week or not? Or do you merely give your name over?
No. So for questions, you do submit a substantive question, but I've never managed to get come in on the ballot on that. So that's a mystery to me how that's working at the moment. As I say, the only question I've managed to ask so far, the only contribution, despite really wanting to talk in the debate on domestic abuse bill, was my question to Jacob Rees-Mogg about cancer, because there's so many people who, as my oncologist said to me this week, he is terrified of a tsunami of people coming when lockdown ends or later on in the year with late-stage cancers, because nobody is going to the doctor at the moment with their dodgy mole or whatever, and that is really worrying him.
Yeah, well, we're hearing that from also from the experts, of course, in the daily news briefing.
Normally, there's 1,000 new cases of cancer every day in the UK, 365,000 a year, and I gather that the number of people presenting is roughly 75% down. Now, and the truth is, if you delay your treatment, the danger is that your chances of survival and of beating the illness diminish.
Well, these are key issues, and you know them personally as well. You're on the MP's WhatsApp groups that I'm not privy to. Are your views shared by others, and how are others coping? Are they wearing their pyjamas to ask questions? Are they getting dressed? I mean, what's going on?
Well, I confess that when I asked my question, I was wearing a jacket, a tie and a shirt, but I was wearing shorts.
But no one knows.
But there's a great issue of deciding where to be filmed, as it were, and what to have in the background. We've all been checking what books are on people's bookshelves.
But while we've been on the phone, my producer, Louisa Wells, who has WhatsApped to me a Twitter account called Bookcase Credibility. That's at B Credibility, in which they are ranking people's bookcases. So you want to get onto that, Chris Bryant, next time you're on.
The thing is, the bookcase in the spare bedroom where I am, because my husband has got the dining room table. The bookcase here is just the bookcase of the stuff that I'm using at the moment. I've got other bookcases. I have my Penguin classics arranged by colour downstairs in the loo. And then I've got, novels and first editions and poetry in another section, and then biography and history in another room as well.
Before you go, I've got to ask you, it's all very well, criticising, that's my job, but you're a politician. You have been in power before, you will be again in the future, no doubt. How would you fix this? How would you make it better? Because they're doing their best in Parliament, aren't they?
Oh, look, I think the simplest thing would be that we should sit on Thursday. I don't understand why we're only doing a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday session. You need more space. I think members need to get better at being brief and to the point, even if they're online. But, for heaven's sake, let's hope that this isn't going to go on forever. I don't think we'll think of this as the ethereal parliament. I don't think we'll think of it as the virtual parliament. In the end, this will be the depression parliament, because my biggest anxiety is about the state of the economy at the end of this year. The FTSE's down best part of 30%. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of businesses that I fear are going to go to the wall. The entertainment industry, by which I mean everything through from hotels to pubs and theatres and all, and live gigs and all the rest of it, who knows when that's going to be starting up again. So I think that this will feel more in the end like the kind of late 1920s and 1930s than this particular moment.
Chris Bryant calling in from the Rhondda. Are you wearing shorts, Chris? Are you fully clothed? I should ask that question.
I am wearing jeans.
Your jeans.
But I've not got any shoes on.
Okay. The shoeless Chris Bryant calling in from the Rhondda. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much. Well, that's it. Thanks to my guests this week, Sir Ian Duncan Smith, Chris Bryant, and of course Baroness Bakewell, Joan Bakewell. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you get a chance, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcast. JGJDJ did just that. And they said the podcast was, quote, a small gem of normality in these uncertain times. Well, thank you, JGJDJ, even if your name is a bit of a mouthful. Reviews like that one make it easy for other people to find our podcast, and we really appreciate it. Now, don't forget, if you work in the NHS, firstly, you're a hero, and secondly, you'll get a free 6-month digital subscription to the Telegraph as our small way of saying thank you. I'll put all the details of that offer in the show notes to this episode as usual. And everyone else, as ever, can get 7 days free access to the Telegraph content by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. Until next time, cheerio!